Good afternoon and welcome to Conversations at Noon. I'm Greatheart Griot Andre Kitt, sitting in for Connecticut Freedom Trail Outreach Director Tammy Denise. Today on Conversations at Noon, we're going to discuss Ebenezer Bassett, the first Black U.S. diplomat, and he's going to be spoken about today by our guest, and he's Dr. William Fothergill. He'll be talking to us today about this. Remember, at the end and during this conversation, you may go into the chat room and ask questions, and we'll discuss and address those afterwards. Fothergill is in faculty in counseling and student development at Central Connecticut State University. He's credentialed as a licensed professional counselor. Mr. Fothergill has a passion for history and research in indigenous cultures. He is the founder and serves as the chairperson of the Ebenezer D. Bassett Memorialization Committee. Mr. Fothergill is an independent historian who specializes in early New England people of color. He has presented at various conferences, historical societies, and conducted workshops on several genealogical topics. His extensive family research has uncovered his family's ties to New England as early as 1680. Mr. Fothergill became inducted a member of the Son of the American Revolution after proving that he is a direct lineal descendant of several Connecticut African-American Native American revolutionaries. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome, Mr. William Fothergill.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank the Connecticut Freedom Trail for giving me this opportunity to present on an individual I think is an outstanding figure. And as I get into my presentation, I'll talk a little bit about the forgotten figure, because many people have not, over time, have not familiarized themselves with Ebenezer Don Carlos Bassett and his significance that he has played throughout his life. And many of the contributions that we enjoy today are in direct connection to the service in his humanitarian spirit. So again, I would like to thank the Connecticut Freedom Trail for the work that they've continued to do over the years. And recently, our committee recently celebrated our Connecticut Freedom Trail for all of their years of dedicated work to preserving African-American history in our state. All right, so we're going to pull up my slides here. All righty. So again, the title of this presentation is Through a Cultural Lens of Blackness, the Making of the First Black U.S. Diplomat. And again, I'm going to make sure that I have ample time at the end for questions, because I like that more important. Over the years, as we've grown this project, central to our mission is to educate people about Mr. Bassett. There is no national or international association that's connected to Mr. Bassett, and we're proud to say at Central Connecticut State University that we are the home of Mr. Bassett. I dedicate this presentation to Mr. Ebenezer Don Carlos Bassett and all the ancestors who left behind what I call breadcrumbs so that we can follow their lead to our past. This presentation will focus on exploring Mr. Bassett's story through a cultural lens in an Afrocentric perspective. Sadly, researchers and historians are so focused on capturing the obvious that they miss what we look at as the substance. A person can tell a story, but it is not as personable unless it is your story. This doesn't mean that the story can't be told with relevance and accuracy, but we must have and or bridge context to the story that must move us beyond just mere facts, but to embrace the feelings, the experiences, the attitudes, the mindsets of these individuals. I don't apologize for encouraging ethnic minorities from telling their own stories. Telling our own story allows us to take the lead in defining who we are, our experiences, and our abilities for self-determination. Our ethnic identity and experiences are just as relevant as dates and times. So as I get into this presentation, I do want to thank a retired emeritus professor here at Central Connecticut State University who kind of opened my eyes to looking at our research in a culture, was Dr. Warren Perry. In my many conversations with him, he always kind of pointed out looking for the clues, that sometimes as we do research, we don't pay attention to what may seem as a simple, but may be a fact, a nugget in the cultural connections, the ancestral connections that are associated. And again, you know, in my conversations with him, I've become more diligent in my research. I'm a social worker, a counselor by trade, so I'm not a history professor or history teacher. So I look at my research in a different lens, and I'm saying that because, you know, as I go forward with this presentation, I just want to put context to that I look at it from a kind of a sociological perspective of looking at people and looking at the culture and looking at the hidden gems that are kind of found in their lives. Mr. Bassett was our nation's first African-American diplomat, and he made significant contributions to our state as well as to within international affairs. So again, I'm going to use a couple of terms here for us to have context to this presentation. So African perspective, or Afrocentrism, or African-centered. And again, those are kind of buried in this presentation. So Afrocentric perspective is a culturally grounded social work practice-based model that affirms and codifies and integrates common culture experiences, values, interpretations that cut across African descent. The term Afrocentrism or Afro-ecology and Afrocentricity were coined in 1980s by the African-American scholar Malafi Asante. Again, looking deeply at some of the cultural variables that are kind of associated and embedded in individual stories and culture. And so throughout this presentation, I'm going to be emphasizing some of those variants. And African-centered, the main principle of African-centered worldviews are interconnectedness of all things, the spiritual nature of human beings, collective and individual identity, the collective inclusive nature of family structures, the openness of mind, body, spirit, and the values of interpersonal relationships. And again, these two concepts are central to understanding Bassett. We look at Bassett in his legacy of life and what he's done, but we put context to it by understanding that many of the things that he did were really deeply embedded in an African centered perspective. Connecticut has a long history of slavery, first beginning with indigenous people in North America, and later the massive importation of African people. Slavery in Connecticut dates far back as the mid-1600s. African people were documented as early in colonial records shortly after the settlement of the colony. The first recorded Africans were documented in Connecticut as early as 1640, and by that time, by the time of the American Revolution, Connecticut had the largest number of slaves in New England. The five northern states that agreed to gradual abolition of slavery were Philadelphia, being the first state to approve, and followed by New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. Connecticut passed the Gradual Abolition Act in 1784. This act did not eliminate any enslaved Africans, but only those who were born in slavery only after they had reached the age of 25. African people in Connecticut have a rich history. They contributed to the development of the state and the nation as non-citizens. They were represented in every war and helped to build the infrastructure that supports our present republic. Connecticut's laws were some of the most insensitive to the abolition of slavery and the treatment of early African people. Ebenezer's great-grandfather was named Pero. It was chronicled that Pero was born somewhere in Connecticut, in the continent of Africa. And the captivity must have taken place in late childhood because Pero spoke specifically, had memories of his family, culture, and his journey to the Americas. Pero claimed that he was the son of an African king, stolen from his family and his village. It is very likely Pero came to Connecticut between 1730 and the early 1740s. And again, I'm giving you the background, this family background, because it's very significant, as I'll later talk about what Bassett acquired from the struggles of his ancestors. According to these early chronicles, Pero was imported from Jamaica and purchased at some point by Captain Samuel and Abigail Riggs of Derby. Samuel Riggs and his family they are connected to many families in Derby, Cheshire, Southington, Farmington, who also possessed African people, like the Johnsons, the Chapmans, the Atwaters. We laugh amongst ourselves, some of us from the Connecticut State Library, because we said all roads lead to Cheshire, but also some of these roads to African people lead to Derby. It is believed that Pero had two sons, Laban and Tobiah. Laban remained in the Briggs household and then later in life adopted his captor's surname, Riggs. Tobiah was sold at some point to Captain John Wooster of Revolutionary War fame. Pero, we don't know much about Pero, with the exception of the details found in an 1874 publication called Chauncey's Judge's Story. Pero shared a similar story to many African captives of his time. He was transported to the West Indies, Jamaica specifically, prior to completing his journey to Connecticut. We don't know how many other stops that may have been included in that journey. Pero appeared to marry twice of record, and his first wife was Phyllis, married in June 30th of 1759, who was a servant of James Wheeler's household. He later married an African captive named Hagar, who was an enslaved woman in the household of Reverend Richard Mansfield of Derby. Pero died on April 13th, 1789 in Oxford, Connecticut. Ebenezer's father, Tobiah, or sometimes recorded as Tobias, was a man of stature, bravery, and courage. Descending from a young African prince, Tobiah Pero carried forward the family's bloodline of leadership. Tobias was an accomplished hunter, which is chronicled. Few men caught more foxes and coons and rabbits or in squirrels than he. Quote, it is chronicled that Tobiah and Rachel were married on June 9th, 1776, in Oxford Congregational Church. Reverend Mansfield is also contributed as performing the ceremony. There is a strong possibility that both of these accounts are true, the former existing as the religious act of marriage, while the later was more ceremonial in nature. Emancipation of Tobiah in his through his service during the Revolutionary War was significant to him gaining his freedom. This was documented in 1781, a Derby land record. Tobias Perot's emancipation for enlisting in service was also documented on March 27, 1787. A certificate titled Shadrach Asborn, Selectman of Woodbury, relating to Tobias as Perot, a Negro inhabitant of Derby. As acceptable practice, individuals could hire or commission to service captives to serve during the early wars. Captain John Wooster petitioned for his enslaved man to do so. Tobiah took advantage of this opportunity to gain his freedom. No matter how respected he was, no matter his cordial relationship with his captor, and no matter how prowess as a hunter Tobias was, he was still an enslaved man. Whether he believed in the cause of independence or not, like many other African captives, the true cause existed as the cause for their freedom and the humanity that would emerge. Independence, freedom, liberty, common words used at the time of the revolution, had a different meaning in context for enslaved African people. They knew they were human beings and believed in the broader form of freedom than their white counterparts. Enlisting was a symbol of equality. Tobiah and others were willing to stand and also die for the cause that would deny them their stake in the independence, but greatly benefited everyone else, many times other than themselves. This service exists as a truest statement of the belief in the ideals espoused by the creation of this new nation. Tobiah was among the number of Connecticut African captives who served during the Revolutionary War. He earned his freedom after years of military service. Some believe these African captives only served to gain their freedom from bondage. For many of these men, physical freedom is a secondary gain. They believed in the ideals proposed by the nation founding fathers. They too saw themselves as having a right to liberty and justice. Military service was their way of contributing to the birth of a new nation. Tobias was one among a number of African American captives who served during the Revolutionary War. He earned his freedom. In the ideals of that freedom, he's passed on to future generations, including Ebenezer Bassett. Ebenezer's grandfather, again Tobias, passed on many life lessons that I think are central to their family. Again, from Perot, traveling across oceans and surviving, and showing that level of fortitude and strength, and passing on that strength to his son, Tobiah, who anchored leadership and courage and bravery, and passing that forward to the next generation, which is Ebenezer's father, Eben Tobias, who was born somewhere around 1805. Tobias was described as a 6-foot tall, ready of speech, and considered a quite witty person. According to Ebenezer himself, he states, I remember that he held the office, and that's the office of what we refer to as the Black governorship, that I remember that he held the office for 2 or 3 terms. And I remember too how Sunday in night he used to pore over books on military tactics and study up on the politics of the state. So Black governors were ceremonial positions or unofficial elected positions that were represented or governed to provide government in as peace officers in resided over judgments in disputes within the African community. I say that they were ceremonial because many of them were kind of organized as a way of having insight by the white residents into the Black community and having control. But it's interesting that when you look at these Black governorships, especially that of Derby, that the leaders there took on a different form. They took advantage of something that was looked as this kind of secondary leadership position, and they really elevated it to a true leadership type of position. I say that because it's really important that when we look at Bassett in his relationship with his father and what he possibly gained, and so that introduction into not a formal sense of politics, but a structural sense of politics within the context of the African community was being handed down to him. He saw this image of Black leaders in his community. Several members of his extended family also were elected as Black governors. So they took this title that had very little significance and they made it very significant to their communities. Mr. Bassett, Ebenezer also describes his father as a mulatto, born in the family of Squire Bassett of Derby. Unlike the vast majority of free and enslaved African people, Tobias was educated. He was an educated and learned man. It's not clear whether his wife Rachel was his scholarly equal. It is interesting in military that he studied military tactics in history and politics, which demonstrates that he was a global learner. So Bassett was being raised in a context of a home that was focused on community in global leadership, strategy. So when we think about him later becoming a diplomat, it wasn't by happenstance, it was on purpose. Tobias and Susan Eben and Susan were the first educators of their children. The children grew up at a time when access to advanced learning was denied African people. Even if it was provided, it was done so with a discriminatory and a defiant manner. Derby provided levels of equality in its for its Black residents, but the passion of becoming a learned person appeared motivated by Ebenezer's parents. Ebenezer grew up in a household that promoted civic responsibility, social responsibility, the importance of advancing the state of African people. Embedded in the African American culture is the quest for knowledge and the importance of education. Somewhere between the late 1820s and the 1830s, Eben and his family left their hometown of Derby and moved to Litchfield, Connecticut. And that's where Ebenezer was born, including his sister Charlotte and his brother Napoleon Bonaparte Bassett. They shortly stayed there. It's not clear why they went there. There was industry emerging in that part of Litchfield County. It may have been for that reason, or it may have been for other family reasons. But the family later returned to Derby. Ebenezer grew up and began his formal education in Derby. And like many cities and towns in Connecticut, Derby remained in conflict, remained in conflict between the abolitionist movement in supporting ending slavery. Connecticut's laws required that education of all of its residents, and so Derby stood out even among larger and more progressive cities because it was one of a few towns in the state that provided an integrated public educational experience for all of its students residing in the city. Ebenezer was privileged from a young age to see equality at work and to be a part of that level of equality. Even though slavery was a legal institution and the laws existed that supported differential treatment between Black and white people, Derby appeared to transcend the boundaries of race and freedom, which allowed students like Ebenezer to receive a desegregated educational experience. Young Ebenezer attended the Brigham School in Derby. Ebenezer worked in the office of Dr. Ambrose Beardsley, who quickly saw the potential of this young man and impressed, and he was impressed with Ebenezer. Dr. Beardsley and Colonel William Wooster encouraged and supported the aspirations of the young scholar of Black freedom. Ebenezer's most significant benefactor wasn't Ambrose Beardsley. And again, this is the challenge in my paper here, because much that have been written about Bassett in the historical context were written by non-African people. And again, I think a part of that is the slant that has been put on the contributions of the white community. I don't negate the contributions of the white community, but when we really look at Bassett's path and who Bassett was connected to, I think many historians have missed the significant contributions that have been made by the African American community on the development, on the life of Ebenezer. Again, these individuals were influences, but I'm going to later, talk about how the African American community really were responsible for the man that we've come to know today. Mr. Bassett's family was also a major player. As I already stated that, again, being a learned family themselves, passing down the love of learning and the love of being civically involved. But also you have to think about Mr. Bassett in the times that Mr. Bassett was growing up, that the vast majority of African people were still enslaved. The Dred Scott case made African people less than human beings. And Mr. Bassett and his family were navigating all those. So I just want you to think about for a moment that, like his father, who was a laborer, that his family made what I call the ultimate sacrifice to allow this Black child to aspire and dream beyond what was imaginable at the time, and to sacrifice to allow him to fulfill his educational dreams when it would have been more profitable for the family to have him as a laborer. Just imagine that the sacrifice of that freedom, of that education, and the desire for your child to be able to reach the ultimate versus the day-to-day of what was the experience of most African people of the times. The Bassetts chose to invest in their child. And I think that became a significant part of Mr. Bassett's character, as we see later on his sacrifice for education and rights and opportunities for others. Ebenezer was accepted and attended the prestigious Wesleyan Academy, currently known as Wilbraham Munson Academy in Wilbraham, Massachusetts. Ebenezer's benefactors included the support of Derby town leaders, encouragement from his community, and the sacrifice of his parents, who made and allowed him to labor in the school rather than in the field or in. After attending Wesleyan Academy, Ebenezer was accepted and enrolled during the fall term at the Connecticut State Normal School in New Britain. The institution is currently known as Central Connecticut State University today. Founded in 1849, the institution existed as Connecticut's oldest public operated institution in Connecticut, University in Connecticut. New Britain is the birthplace of public education in Connecticut. And through Mr. Bassett's lead, it is also the home of diversity and inclusion in the state, in higher education. Ebenezer not only attended the school at the State Normal School, but he became the school's first African-American or first person of color to graduate at the institution, but graduate with distinction and honor. Mr. Bassett became a part of the New Britain community, which was also similar to Derby, a split community of individuals fighting for greater freedoms for African people and those that resisted. Mr. Bassett joined the First Baptist Church of New Britain, where he continued to attend until his completion of his education, and he moved outside the city. The church community made a significant impact on Mr. Bassett. Years later, after residing in New Haven, Mr. Bassett and his wife, Liza, selected Reverend Whitsley of the First Church of New Britain to officiate their marriage. Some believe Henry Barnard was an educational reformist, recruited Mr. Bassett. Again, looking at Bassett's life and researching his connections, that may have been so. Mr. Barnard, nationally, influenced our educational system, the educational system that we have today with teacher learning and opportunities for teacher development are really concepts of Mr. Barnard. But Mr. Barnard also wasn't a true proponent of integrated education. And that's kind of ironic because the first person of color to attend the institution that he was the president at was a person of color. But again, the structures of education, the foundations of education, Mr. Bassett absorbed all of that. And we would see later on how he applied it in the educational arenas that he was a part of. Henry Barnard, appointed to the State Normal School, made him the institution's first superintendent, while in 1852, Ebenezer became the first African-American accepted and enrolled at the institution. Records of the times do not identify any resistance or opposition to Mr. Bassett's enrollment. And this is different because other towns and cities in the state tried to integrate their school systems, and they face a lot of opposition. I've scanned newspapers and chronicles of the times, and I haven't come across anything of any opposition to Bassett being this first person to walk the annals of this new institution and new idea. In 1853, he completed his studies at the State Normal School with honors. The commencement took place at the South Congregational Church, currently known as South Church, the very institution that years earlier broke off from the First Church on moral issues around the abolishment of African people. He presented his final paper, The True Teacher. Ebenezer remained an active member of the institution's alumni association and consistently corresponded with the university for years after graduating. It appears that Ebenezer was involved in the national affairs of African Americans as early as 1854, where he was a delegate to the 1854 Connecticut National Convention of Colored Men. It was held in Middletown. He also attended in 1855 the convention which was held in Tuscott at the Tuscott Street Church in Hartford in April of 1855. It appears Mr. Bassett was involved in the national affairs of African Americans as early as 1854, where he was a delegate at the 1854 Connecticut State Convention, held in Middletown. With his teaching credentials, Mr. Bassett went on to teach at the Whiting School in New Haven. In New Haven, as many of you may know, was the breeding ground for advocacy in the abolitionist movement and human rights. So Mr. Bassett planted himself in the right space. That's also where he became acquainted with his lifelong friend, Frederick Douglass, amongst other national prominent leaders. The Black community in New Haven became the training ground for Mr. Bassett. Nationalism became the framework of his life. Black nationalism emphasized the integration of and the affection of Africa and the commitment to the ideals rooted in Black people experience in the United States. The Black Christian Church played a significant role in the development of Bassett. When you're looking in the research of Bassett, you begin to see how the Black leaders were very prominent in guiding Mr. Bassett, and primarily from the AME Church were significant and were really responsible for many of the opportunities that he had, including his appointment at the Institute for Colored Youth, which is currently today Cheney University, which is the oldest historically Black institution in our country, and also his later appointment as resident minister to Haiti. The Black church existed as the central political and structural force within the Black community. The Dixwell Avenue Church, Congregational Church, which currently exists as one of Connecticut's most progressive Black churches on the issues of civil rights. Bassett's moral circle included Black pastor leaders and educators who were all affiliated with these national organizations that he was a part of, primarily the Convention of Colored Men. Ebenezer's was a member of the Connecticut chapter of this organization and brought him forefront and centered with the nation's most progressive minds on the issues of equality and justice. Mr. Bassett quickly emerged as a leading voice of the abolitionist movement. Again, some of these leaders are James W. Pennington, which I think most of us are very familiar with, Amos Beeman. The list is extensive. When you see all of these distinguished prominent men in their roles in the development of Mr. Bassett and the trajectory that that were a part of Mr. Bassett's life. Mr. James Pennington goes on to Philadelphia, and it's interesting to see his connection with how when Bassett went out to Philadelphia, following some of the same paths and connecting with some of the same individuals. So it was, to me, mentorship at its. The National Convention of Colored Men, America introduced a resolution in 1869 for the annexation of Haiti. The AME Church was a significant force in the abolitionist in Black rights movement in the 19th century. The integration between politics and the Black church was a dominant force in the 19th century and continues to remain so today. The Black church exists as the voice in a system of political social service and advocacy. Ebenezer's teaching credentials made him the right individual to eventually become the second principal of the Institute for Colored Youth. I want to just say this about him because he took the best of this state normal school's reformist beliefs and he implanted it at this school, which was a more of a training, refining school when he got there. And he began to invest in buildings. He began to invest in the curriculum, requiring that they weren't just preparing people to be good maids and laborers, but he was preparing them to be scholarly individuals. And that's all about a part of Bassett's investment in the Institute for Colored Youth. People from other countries throughout the world came to the Institute for Colored Youth to see the great work that was being done by Bassett. So he left Cheney University a great legacy. The mayor of Philadelphia under Bassett's management was widely known and questionably the foremost institution of its kind, quote. Mr. Bassett went on to use Cheney University as a ground for recruitment of African men to serve in the Civil War. He did things that would cause the question, and he was always willing to lean deeply into these issues. And again, I come back to the state of his parents and his family, who showed that sacrifice was more important than just settling. This is the Faith Congregational Church, which was formerly known as Tocket Street Church. Mr. Bassett eventually became the minister resident, which is the equivalent today of an ambassador. He was the first person of color, the first Black person to hold such a great honor. So before there was Condoleezza Rice, before there was Colin Powell, even before there was Barack Obama, there was Ebenezer Bassett. He paved the way. About 12 Yale professors supported his application and nomination. I'm still digging to see whether there was any support from his alma mater, Central Connecticut State University. Mr. Bassett stepped into a world that I don't think he really expected, but he was the man of the occasion. Mr. Grant appointed him. He was appointed with unanimous and bipartisan support for this position. Haiti was at its brink in multiple civil wars, and he stepped off the boat into a place of conflict, putting his life, his loved ones in harm's way. But he stood as a pinnacle during those rough times for Haiti, and also stood against the United States, which eagerly tried to annex the island and use it for its own means. And Bassett saw this, along with all the other Black leaders, was as an opportunity to showcase that Blacks had the capacity to lead and they had the capacity to self-govern. So Haiti was almost like an experiment for African leaders of the times. It was an opportunity not just saying that it was just an island, or we were going to send this man over to represent the United States at this island. But it was a place that they rallied around as a great opportunity to showcase what a civilized, what a nationalized, what a moral led country could be. So when we come back to the culture of Afrocentrism that we look at, there's a great responsibility for each one to represent the larger. And so Bassett and many of these leaders understood that it wasn't about Bassett, but it was about the greater good for all African people. So Haiti was the symbol of Black self-governance. Bassett served at a time of the great experiment to see Haiti as the proving ground for Blackness in political and social places in the world. Haiti served as the first African-American democracy in the hemisphere. It was tied to the success of Black people as a whole. Its failure would limit Black people's capacity to show their abilities to self-govern and disprove those who sought to prove cultural inferiority, incompetence of all Black people. How would African American be afforded citizenship and freedom if they were given it, and then they failed? So there was a lot of pressure on Bassett as well as our Black leadership of the times to make this work. Here's a letter that kind of documents and supports this. This is a letter from Frederick Douglass to Bassett. My dear Bassett, let me congratulate you and rejoice with you. Your appointment is a great achievement for yourself and for our whole people. I have no doubt that you see the importance of your position, as you shall acquit yourself in it wisely. Otherwise, we shall be affected favorably or unfavorably. Frederick Douglass, April 13th, 1869. And as I said, the AME Church was central in the development of Bassett and the role that Bassett played. That these Black leaders, and as I said, there's an arm length of these prominent leaders who are molding, who are crafting this young man to be the diplomat that we know today. Ebenezer Don Carlos Bassett is buried with his wife, his children, and his younger brother in the Grove Street Cemetery in New Haven. And these last photos are some of the commemorations that we've done on our campus and our student reenactors of Mr. Bassett. October 16th was Mr. Bassett's, would have been his 190th birthday. So happy birthday, Mr. Don Carlos, Ebenezer Don Carlos Bassett. And I will conclude my presentation with this photo.
Thank you so much, Mr. Fothergill. That is a wealth of information, quite interesting, a font of knowledge here for us today as you discuss this truly extraordinary first Black diplomat. We have some questions in the chat room. I'm going to go ahead and start off with Patricia Morin. She says, where is Cheney University located?
Cheney University is located in Pennsylvania. It used to be formerly in Philadelphia, but now it's in an external adjacent community, probably about 20, 30 minutes from Philadelphia.
Oh, okay. And Tammy Denise says, what connection, if any, did Bassett have with Frederick Douglass? And you just read the letter, so if you had any more to add.
Yeah, they I'm laughing because a good colleague of mine that used to be here at this institution, we used to have debates. He was a Frederick Douglass person. I'm a Bassett person, so we have these little debates. But the relationship, I describe it as it's a mentoring relationship, because remember, Mr. Frederick Douglass was significantly older than Bassett, but their paths, they walk together, and that's why it's kind of ironic that a lot of people don't understand when people know Frederick Douglass. They know Frederick Douglass. You go anywhere, it's like, oh yeah, Frederick Douglass. You say, well, do you know Ebenezer Bassett? Well, to me, you can't know Frederick Douglass without knowing Bassett, because they're intertwined so much that here you are these great statesmen who formed this friendship earlier in Bassett's career. But later on, there was some strains between the two men and stuff. And there was some differences of opinions in regards to the direction. I always say Frederick Douglass liked the limelight. Douglass didn't. Douglass was powerful. Bassett was powerful behind the curtain. And so, Frederick Douglass loved the curtain. He loved to be in front of the curtain. So it's a friendship. They, like I said, they went through some conflict towards the end. I think both men tried to heal that conflict, but again, I can say this, sir, that one of Bassett's sons is named in honor of Frederick Douglass. So that shows you how much Frederick Douglass cared about Bassett.
Absolutely. Now, can you say more about the reason why Black people left and went to South Church?
Well, the South Church split off from the First Congregational Baptist Church. And the conflict was about the abolitionists and the freedom of Black people. The South Church did not believe in the freedom and equality of Black people. And that's true about many of Connecticut's towns and cities. They were split. New Britain is a prime example. We got major leaders in the community that they were opposed by other leaders within the community. So the church kind of like today, churches have disagreements, right? And then they split off. And that's what happened, that these two churches split off. I just found it ironic that the very church that split off, that was anti liberation of Black people, was the church that Bassett did his formal address at. So again, it was just some differences of opinion in regards to the freedom of African people.
What about you talked about the Black church in Hartford, where Ebenezer Bassett was affiliated? Was
Faith
that
Congregational? Yeah.
Say that again.
Faith Congregational, which was known as Talcott Street Church.
So Aaron Good just came in with a question. Aaron says, does Mr. Fothergill know more about Bassett's time in New Haven, such as where he lived, his social circle, or any political or social organizations in which he would have been involved?
Yeah, after leaving New Britain, Bassett must have been in love with New Haven. And again, rightfully so, because New Haven was very progressive. It was the place to be in Connecticut. It wasn't Hartford, the state capital. It was New Haven. New Haven, where was the sea of Black mobilizing and in elevating themselves educationally and scholarly and in the community. New Haven was it. So he never really formally left New Haven. No matter what he did, he always ended back up in New Haven. It was almost like, even when he went to Philadelphia, it was almost like he had a house in New Haven and stuff, because he would always come back. His church. So when we think about the abolitionist movement in the churches that were progressive of the times, that's where Bassett was. Again, as we just honored a couple of years ago, William Lanson is a cousin of Bassett. So he had family in New Haven. So there's so many connections that Haven was the place that polished, it was the place that he stepped out formally as a political figure for African rights. So, the tie with New Haven is deep for Bassett. And then his wife he found his wife in New Haven. So,
Oh, there it is.
yeah.
That was the closer. That was the deal right there. So, Mr. Fothergill, thank you so much for joining us today on Conversations at Noon with that just font of information, treasure trove about Ebenezer Bassett, our first Black U.S. diplomat. Thank you for joining us, and hopefully you'll come back to visit us again. And to everybody out there who's been listening and contributed questions, please know that the Connecticut Freedom Trail illustrates important aspects of Connecticut's African American history as well as the history of our state. The trail highlights places and objects of national, state, or local significance, including historic districts, churches, residences, government buildings, cemeteries, grave sites, monuments, and archaeological sites. The Freedom Trail was established by the General Assembly in August 1995. It's under the oversight of the Amistad Committee. We have very exciting things coming up in the future. On the Freedom Trail, Tuesday, November 28th, 2023 at 12 noon, Sleeping with the Ancestors, the educational value of sleeping in slave dwellings with Joseph McGill. And Tuesday, December 12th, 2023 at 12 noon, Connecticut Freedom Trail, you'll see Year in Review, 2023 Year in Review with Tammy Denise, Charles Warner Jr., and Mr. Todd Levine. Thanks for joining us here today. We had a great time. We learned a lot. We got time for one more question from Todd Levine. Well, actually, it's not a question. Todd Levine just wants to say thanks for joining us too. Everybody else, take care. Until next time we see you, peace.